This past year has been one of the busiest I've ever had. I could never have imagined 2 years ago that starting this podcast would have brought me the most amazing listeners in the world, or that they would go from listeners to the best book launch team I could have imagined. Since we're celebrating Thanksgiving in the United States this week, I wanted to take a moment to tell you just how thankful I am for everything you've done for me and this podcast. From sharing the show with your friends and family, to writing such kind words and Amazon reviews for the story behind book, to supporting the show on Patreon, and for all those times you've shared trivia you've learned on the show, or shared trivia back with me. I hope your holiday season is a happy one, and I look forward to seeing where the story behind goes in 2019, because you've proven that even though I write and produce the show, you are actually what makes the show great. So, thank you. I hope listeners in the United States had a lovely Thanksgiving, and hopefully can have some fun conversation about today's topic while eating the leftovers. You're listening to The Story Behind, the extraordinary history of the ordinary. I'm your host, Emily Prokop, and this is the story behind cranberry sauce. Cranberries are native to North America and grow well in areas of the continent with colder climates like the Northeast and the Great Lakes area. New Jersey is known for its cranberries, but if you wonder why you only see them out around the holidays, it's because their harvest season is only 6 weeks. Usually spanning the time between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Cranberries can be a bit high maintenance when it comes to looks. Only 2 to 5% actually look plump and round enough to be put in bags, which we see in the grocery stores. The best and healthiest berries are said to bounce when dropped. This was discovered in the 1840s by a grower named John Pegleg Webb. No, he wasn't a pirate, but he discovered one day that when he spilled some cranberries, the ones that didn't bounce were the damaged ones. Because of this, the bounce test is a real thing that cranberries are put through when deciding which ones get packaged whole and which ones go into making things like cranberry juice or cranberry sauce. If you're wondering about the name, the berry is called so because of the plant's resemblance to a crane. And when settlers came to America, they called it a craneberry, which ended up turning into what we know today as cranberry. As you know, sometimes I end up in a rabbit hole when doing research for episodes, and this week's rabbit hole started with me reading about how the cranberries are native to North America, but wondering what prompted the Irish band The Cranberries, fronted by the late Dolores O'Riordan, to use the name. It turns out when the band was originally formed, they called themselves the Cranberry Saw Us, which said fast and with an Irish accent sounds like the cranberry sauce. It's possible that the wordplay was a vague reference to the disputed lyrics in the Beatles' Strawberry Fields Forever toward the end, when John Lennon can be heard saying cranberry sauce over and over. That's one of the phrases that's included in the Paul is Dead conspiracy theory, by the way. That line has been misheard as John Lennon singing, "I Buried Paul." Want to hear it again? By the way, if you enjoyed that, go back to the episode from June 19th, 2017 about the story behind subliminal messages to hear more. As I mentioned, the harvest season for cranberries is the late fall, early winter time. Native Americans used cranberries for all sorts of things, like dyes, medicine, and a dish sweetened with maple syrup. Though historians sometimes disagree on exactly what foods were served at the first Thanksgiving, the majority agree that cranberries, in some form, were served. But one instance that really pushed it into our traditional Thanksgiving spread was General Ulysses S. Grant, who had it alongside the Thanksgiving turkey with his soldiers in 1864. Cranberries have long been used for medicinal purposes as well. Throughout the centuries, cranberries were used as medicine to help purify blood, help stomach problems, and treating the common cold. It makes sense since they contain enough amounts of vitamin C, and they would be considered what's now known as a superfood. But there's no shortage of marketing the cranberry products now to propel the benefits of cranberries. In fact, when I was going to school for journalism, one of the examples of digging deeper for a story was the now ubiquitous claim that cranberry juice is supposed to be a good way to prevent and help treat urinary tract infections. But if you dig deeper into that claim, the studies it was based on were funded by none other than Ocean Spray. Not to say the data isn't accurate, but it did teach me to be skeptical when it came to researching. In the early 1900s, a lawyer by the name of Marcus Uran decided he had enough of the courtroom and bought a cranberry bog. He knew the peak season was short for harvesting and selling the fruit, but he had an idea. He wanted to make cranberries available year-round, or at least longer than the usual season. He came up with the idea of canning them. Because of the natural pectin contained in cranberries, it naturally congeals together to make a sort of jelly. By the way, the official name of the canned sauce you probably know best is jellied cranberry sauce. At the time, cranberries were harvested by hand, with people picking them off the vines one at a time. But in the 1930s, growers realized it was easier to flood the cranberry fields so cranberries would naturally pop off the vines, and because of pockets of air within the berry, they would float to the surface. Because of ocean spray commercials showing farmers in rubber coveralls standing in bogs of cranberries, many assume they grow in water. But the flooded fields seen in the commercial are a very temporary thing. Now, though, cranberry growers in Wisconsin are under fire because of the flooding and draining of the water back into the natural streams and lakes, which the EPA approves of, but the problem, according to Native American tribes in the area, is the pesticides used on the plant that then get transferred to the water and dumped. This has led to a decrease in fish population and an increase in toxic chemicals within the water. We'll have to watch what happens with that debate, but until then, I hope you got your favorite kind of cranberries this year, whether it was homemade sauce, the jellied log, or the lack of it altogether. If you're listening to this when it comes out, you probably heard about the recall on romaine right now. Now, going to Thanksgiving without a salad may sound like a reluctant dieter's dream, but in 1959, it wasn't the optional salad being tossed from the dinner table, but it was the cranberries. A few days before Thanksgiving, the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Arthur Fleming, told Americans that cranberries were contaminated with a weed killer known to cause cancer in lab rats. What he failed to mention was that the trace amounts of this chemical on cranberries was extremely small, and the lab rats in the study proving the cancerous effects would have had to eat 15,000 cranberries to get the equivalent amount of the chemical every day for years. But that didn't matter. By the time the news spread, cranberries were discarded from kitchens, menus were changed, and even First Lady Mamie Eisenhower basically nailed the cranberry coffin closed that year when she was photographed serving applesauce instead. But if you've ever wondered what lengths presidential candidates would go to prove themselves, look no further than Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, who were campaigning that year for the 1960 election. Despite the scare, Nixon proved he had an iron gut by grabbing 4 handfuls of the berries and eating them while he was passing through Wisconsin. Countering his opponent, Kennedy was photographed that same day drinking not 1, but 2 glasses of cranberry juice. This was considered one of the first mass food scares because a year earlier, an amendment known as the Delaney Clause was added to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that banned any artificial substance in food that was shown to cause cancer in lab rats at any dose. It's those final 3 words, at any dose, that is actually controversial for food scientists, especially in the case of imagining someone even consuming 15,000 cranberries every single day for years. But for all you who suggested throwing cranberry sauce in the garbage can on the poll I put in the Facebook group, 1959 would have been a great Thanksgiving for you. But if you're planning on going back in time to celebrate a cranberry-less Thanksgiving, just know that by Christmas, Fleming released that the lots of cranberries that were impounded had finally tested clean. Information for this episode was sourced from Vox, National Geographic, Forbes, and more links which can be found in the show notes at thestorybehindpodcast.com. Just a reminder, if you listened to last week's episode, you heard about Podcast Brunch Club's giveaway for the Story Behind book. Podcast Brunch Club is like a book club, but for podcasts. So if you're a fan of podcasts, you can get together with others who won't find it weird that every sentence out of your mouth begins with, "I heard on a podcast." Definitely check out podcastbrunchclub.com for information about how you can join a local chapter, and also look for details about the Story Behind book giveaway coming soon. I also wanted to mention that I really appreciate when people make suggestions for episodes. And it's always funny when someone makes a suggestion as I'm researching something related. So when Daniel Repples from Toe on the Trigger suggested I do a series at some point on the Paul is Dead theory, I had to laugh thinking of the research for this episode And for the special series I'm going to be working on, that will be exclusive to Patreon supporters in the new year. And speaking of which, this episode is brought to you by the Story Behind executive producers who support the show through the Patreon page at patreon.com/thestorybehind. They also get access to full scripts of these episodes before they go live. Thanks for listening.